Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of Mapping the Zone, podcast dedicated to the works of Thomas Pynchon. In this episode, we are going to cover the play within The Crying of Lot 49, The Courier's Tragedy. This is about a 6-page play, as it were. It's more of a summary of the play, and there's a lot going on in it to the point that it is almost intentionally obscure and hard to follow. So this episode is basically just going to be us kind of talking about what we think about it and what we came away with from reading it. So I will kind of kick things off and mention that I've spent a good chunk of the last week or so kind of going over the Charles Hollander article about how not just the play, but the whole of Lot 49 is a sort of cautionary tale of the JFK assassination and the implications that came with it. We mentioned this on the last episode about Chapter 3. I want to know how Luke and Will, how you guys feel about that overall concept applying really more focused in the play.
Yeah, I mean, I think we got into this a little bit last week. There are some kind of details in the play that do seem to point to it being a possible reference to the JFK assassination. I want to say Will brought up the fact that whenever Niccolo is assassinated, there are three assassins who show up who I don't think are in the official text of the play. It was the director's kind of creative edition. Yeah, Creative Liberty. Yeah. Sorry. Which is interesting. I did look over that Hollander thing a bit too, which he does mention the fact that I think Congress in the late 70s, went over the JFK assassination and the Warren Report and did talk about how Lee Harvey Oswald would have really struggled to get off 3 shots with the type of rifle he was using. And the number of shots that Lee Harvey Oswald did was 3. So we'll link that to the shooters on the knoll, on the grassy knoll, which I do think is a good comparison to make. It is. I did notice this time going through the play that those assassins are described as somewhat like mutants, or like somehow like deformed, somehow like maybe perhaps supernatural, which is kind of it maybe speaks to the fact of, how there's so much about the JFK assassination that is unexplained and perhaps at this point in time unexplainable. I am kind of the opinion that with the JFK assassination that we'll never really know exactly what happened, and so we kind of have to turn to stuff like fan theories and stuff.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I think it's obviously I think it's arguably the most famous conspiracy theory. Maybe the moon landing being the only other one that could surpass it, but I think this is the one that most people, even the ones that would normally not ascribe to conspiracy theories, might have a little bit more sway in falling on the side of there's more to this than we were originally told. I think it comes down to an Occam's razor kind of situation for me, and that the idea that we don't have, like you said, we don't have a whole lot of evidence either way anymore because of how things were handled at the time. And things disappeared or were destroyed or whatever the case was. And so we probably never will know. I think using all the information that we currently have, the Oswald theory holds some water, but at the same time, like I as someone who I spent a lot of my early life hunting, I know how difficult it is to get off even one accurate shot from a distance. So to get 3 on a moving target in that kind of situation, it is hard to believe, but at the same time, I also struggle to believe that there could be such a massive government cover-up when, even 10 years later, they couldn't cover up a break-in at a hotel. It kind of makes it difficult to really come down on either side of the fence for me. But it's nonetheless absolutely fascinating. And I think that with this, I definitely think there is some symbolism in here that is a little more intentional, that kind of points to that idea that there was some kind of involvement and that Oswald was not the one responsible, or at least not the only one responsible.
Definitely. So there are kind of, in my mind, there are a few different ways you interpret all of the events surrounding the JFK shooting. And there's the typical kind of conspiracy theory, which just says that, Oswald was a patsy. There were 3 guys on the grassy knoll that each took shots at him. And to some extent, like Don DeLillo in Libra does a pretty good job of forging the connections between those old school conspiracy theory explanations. And then there's a newer explanation that still is a conspiracy theory that holds a lot less. It's a lot less sinister, I suppose. And I don't know if either of you have heard this. It's basically the idea that one of the Secret Service agents had a misfire and shot JFK, and that accounts for one of the bullets.
I have heard that, yeah.
Yeah, that's the one. I find that one pretty believable, honestly.
That one's the most believable to me, but it feels too simple at the same time to be entirely baseless, because it's entirely built on assumptions. But who trusts the Warren Report? Like, this whole play is to some extent kind of a parody of the Warren Report and the what's his name paper about the magic eye of Lot 49.
Yeah, this is something I got into in the episode last week, but I do think that the information overload of the play could be a reference to the Warren Report, throwing so much information at the consumer of the play leads to a sense of, like what parts of this am I supposed to care about, what parts am I not supposed to care about. Oedipa herself seems to kind of struggle with what's important and what's not important generally in this play, which I do think could be, this is, I guess, a bit of a spoiler, but we get into Maxwell's demon, I want to say in the next chapter, maybe in the 5th chapter.
Chapter 4.
4, yeah.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, one part of Maxwell's demon is some type of entity kind of perfectly sorting through information, which does seem to kind of apply to the book as a whole and perhaps to the play. And one thing I noticed this time through the play is that the summary of the play in the book is a mixture of high and low art. Like a lot of the, like the actual dialogue of the play is I think like blank verse or something. It's very very complicated and historically accurate, I assume. And then the narrator adds some kind of like the narrator's phrasing when he's summarizing the play does seem to be a bit maybe not crass or anything, but just a bit informal. So there's a weird mix of formal and informal in the play, a mix of like high art and low art that does seem to be kind of it adds to the confusion of the entire thing.
Yeah, right here I have a quote. Honest Niccolo, who always has difficulty hiding his feelings, observes that if the 2 events turn out to be at all connected and can be traced to Duke Angelo, boy, the Duke better watch out is all. Or it just jumps mid-sentence, not even, between the verses of the play and the narration of the summary. It just mid-sentence jumps from kind of a high art, pretentious framing to, yeah, you better watch out.
One thing I think is interesting that I kind of just thought of in the last few minutes is the fact that Dreblet, this is a spoiler, but Dreblet eventually kills himself. And Dreblet calls himself, he later in the chapter talks about how the play is basically all in his head, and that without him, the play wouldn't happen, the play would have no significance. And then he later dies. So, I do think that the JFK assassination, our view on it would be quite different if Lee Harvey Oswald hadn't been assassinated, and then if the person who assassinated Lee Harvey Oswald hadn't also died within, I think, a year or 2 of the assassination, maybe 2 or 3.
Pretty short, yeah.
So that does kind of speak. That does seem to be also kind of a reference to like the person who, without that person, none of this would happen. None of this would have happened. Dying pretty quickly afterwards. Therefore, leaving the audience and Oedipa herself with more questions than answers.
The one part that really stuck out to me when I was reading through this again, and I tried to reread it again a couple of times, and I did so today again with the whole JFK thing kind of looming in my mind. And I did find, so there's a brief little part right as the summary of the play is starting, and it's talking about Pasquale's plot to do away with Niccolo by basically playing hide and seek and tricking him into getting into a cannon. The description of what would happen, what he was hoping to happen, is so evocative of the JFK assassination, especially having seen the Zapruder film. It took me a second to like process, and then when I reread it, I was like, "Holy shit!" So it says, "Out in a bloody rain to feed our fields, amid the monad roar of Nitra's song and Sulphur's cantus firmus." So I had to look some of this up because I had no idea off the top of my head what some of this was. But the "out on a bloody rain to feed our fields," obviously, JFK was in a car driving past not a field necessarily, but Dealey Plaza definitely has its grassy areas. Amid the Maenad roar. So that was one thing I had to look up. So Maenad in Greek mythology was a female follower of Dionysus, and the word itself means mad or demented. And nitra is a sort of gunpowder that was used in the Civil War. I think it was potassium nitrate specifically. Yeah. And then sulphur's cantus firmus. So the only thing I could find for cantus firmus is it's a musical term about polyphonic choruses. So several voices, lots of voices kind of happening at once. So in kind of rereading it as, this moment of bloodshed on a field or a grassy area where there's these mad or at that point demented people who just saw a man killed and his head literally explode from gunshots. And the cantus firmus, many gunshots. We were talking earlier about the 3 potential gunmen. So that stopped me kind of in my tracks when I reread that and kind of put that layer on top of it.
Yeah, and I think I could be getting the timeline of the play wrong, but I think Niccolo's eventual death does seem to lead into, I think it's somebody being tortured, I want to say. It does lead into some violence, which I've read stuff about, not maybe as it relates to Pynchon specifically, just stuff in general about Kennedy supposedly opposing the war, like the escalation of the war in Vietnam. Kennedy basically being opposed to a bunch of different stuff that eventually happened. One thing with that is I didn't put this together very quickly, but I want to say the Gulf of Tonkin incidents happened pretty quickly after JFK was assassinated. I could be wrong about that.
It's definitely either right before or right after. That was basically kind of a pretext to get into Vietnam.
Yeah.
It was August 2nd and 3rd, 1964.
Okay, yeah. So it would have been,
about a year after.
8 or not even a year after. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there does seem to be a connection between things like our efforts to undermine the Cuban rule of Fidel Castro and stuff like that. Like Kennedy does seem to be greatly opposed to a bunch of stuff that ended up happening under LBJ. And there are some rumors, I think, about Kennedy doing some like kind of sweeping changes to American stuff. One thing I also just thought of is this chapter does feature mentions of the mafia and Cosa Nostra, which I do believe that Kennedy was associated with, like having pissed off the mafia, and I think he was kind of involved in escalating the effort to stop the mafia's growth in the U.S.
Yeah, well, there are rumors that his father was involved in the mafia in a quid pro quo scheme sorts.
So something that Hollander brought up that I thought was interesting was the connection to the character of David that's mentioned when Oedipa is when she first finds out about waste, is a reference to John de Witt, who was a Dutch statesman who, to kind of summarize everything, was kind of in a similar sense to JFK, was opposed to a lot of what William of Orange was doing, and ended up getting killed and publicly displayed. And it was, it was this whole big thing. And so, and Hollander says in his article, and I'm going to quote it here because I think it's pretty important how he phrases this. If we stand to lot 49 as Oedipa stands to the Courier's tragedy, there should be some relation between what we get and what she gets. The play, the text within the text, reveals something analogous, not to what Oedipa is looking for, information about bones and some connection to Inverarity's estate, but to what we should be alert to by now, having to do with political assassination. We have been alerted to Dallas. Oedipa, like other Pynchon characters, faced with information they have been seeking, doesn't get it. We should. The analog in the play is political assassination.
That is a pretty concise summary of what's going on in this chapter, and especially the play, I think, yeah.
I do find it difficult, just I think out of some contrarian impulse, to fully endorse Hollander's reading, if only because I look at his arguments and I say, well, that makes complete sense. But I also see a lot of places where, yeah, sure, that person had that name, and DeWitt is probably not necessarily a false flag, but you can't just, ascribe your specific understanding of the whole book based on, half of the names having perceived connection to your reading.
Yeah, no, and I absolutely agree. I think I don't agree with his analysis of the whole book being a JFK tale. I do find that connection more so in the play itself, and he even goes on to mention that he says the technique here is enthymematic. An enthymeme is a rhetorical device consisting of a logical construct within the conclusion unexpressed to be drawn by the reader or listener. So I think that right there is kind of he kind of goes on to make some connections that are, I think I mentioned this in the earlier episode, that are pretty tenuous and really you really have to stretch to get them there. And I think that, and again, we talked about this with the chapter 3 episode. I personally see the book more as the kind of semiotic reading of it, where we are looking for symbols where there may be none, and creating meaning out of something that may or may not actually be there. And I think that's kind of the whole point of the book as a whole, as with a lot of Pynchon's other stuff as well. But I think the play itself is where I can really draw the JFK connection.
Yeah, I agree. I completely believe that Hollander's going about it the right way when it comes to interpreting this novel and interpreting Pynchon's novels. I just wish he weren't so insistent on one particular reading. Because, yeah, absolutely. The magic eye analogy is a perfect way to look at this book. You keep your eye on the plot and you keep your eye on the theme, and something happens between the two of them. That I just find it let me scroll through 1 second. I saw something earlier in the essay that really,
this whole book it's kind of like choose your own interpretation. And I do think that this book, you can read this book and this chapter and the play as being a metaphor for the JFK assassination, or you can just view it as a complete red herring. I mean, the mention of Dallas earlier in this chapter, it could be a red herring. It does seem to be somewhat random in the context of the sentence it's in. None of it. There's no real smoking gun, I would say, that we can point to that definitively links this book to the JFK assassination. I think that's kind of one of the beauties of this book, though, is, it's something that we've gone over in general, but there's so many different interpretations you can draw from the book, and each of them has points for that interpretation, and then you can also find exceptions to the rule about that interpretation. So,
yeah, and I think that's true of Pynchon in general. that there's, and we talked about this. There's no one particular way, as Will said, to analyze any of his work, and I think that the point of it all is to kind of get you thinking. There's so much that's sprinkled throughout every one of his books, and so many references and ideas that you kind of have to go and search for the answers for, or not necessarily the answers. You have to go and search for the meaning of. And I think that that's part of what I really like about his work is he's not going to do the work for you. It's up to you to go, if you don't understand this particular science terminology he's using, or if you don't understand this historical reference, it's kind of on you to go look it up to get the context that you need to further analyze what it is you're reading and to come away with your interpretation of that.
Yeah, he's not going to compromise an accurate metaphor for the sake of accessibility.
Right. There's no footnotes in a Pynchon book. It's you go get your encyclopedia, go jump on Wikipedia, and do some research.
What were both of your guys' impressions of the play the first time through, beyond just inscrutable? Did you come to anything more specific?
Yeah, I mean, I know you said beyond inscrutable, but that's mostly what I focused on whenever I first read the play, is how confusing it was. I didn't know what to care about, who to care about. I honestly I remember getting confused about who Nicolo even was. A lot of the information seemed to kind of just go in one ear, out the other. I find it very confusing. And I mean, it is vaguely entertaining. It does have a Shakespearean type feel to it. Like, you do kind of feel like you might be reading a summarization of a Shakespeare play. I'm not an expert on Shakespeare. There are a few Shakespeare plays whose titles are coming to mind as possible inspirations for this, but I don't even have summaries of Shakespeare's plays memorized. So I don't want to make an ass of myself by comparing it to one of them. But I do think that there are probably some aspects of Shakespeare's. I mean, there's an aspect of Shakespeare's, like, tragedies, comedies, and histories probably to this play.
Yeah, it's I think Hamlet's probably the Shakespeare play that's most like this, for obvious reasons. Father dies, gotta kill incestuous family, etc. But it actually seems like the inspiration for the title, at least, would be the Revenger's Tragedy, which is a contemporaneous Jacobean revenge play with a similarly large cast of characters and a somewhat convoluted plot, though it doesn't seem similar in any real way, just big number of characters.
I know the first time I read this was, I think, this was a little bit later in my reading of Pynchon, and I don't know why specifically, but I know for sure the first time I read it and I got to the play, it was like I was in a fugue state, and I just kind of like finished it, and I was like, what the fuck? What did I just read? And I think part of that is I have never really been a huge Shakespeare fan. I respect his work. It just has never resonated with me in any particular way. My father-in-law is a huge Shakespeare fan. I should probably ask him if he could provide some insight on any connections here. But it's definitely, there is that information overload. There's so many just characters that are thrown in all of a sudden that I had no idea who was who. The kind of shift to hyper violence when Domenico is being tortured was jarring. I know to expect it now because I've read it a few times, but getting to that point in a book where there hadn't really been any violence at all, and then just getting this like George R.R. Martin level of torture was a really kind of whiplash situation. But as I've read it more, parts of it have clicked. I still, I'll fully admit, I still have trouble piecing together the kind of linearity of it all and who's who, but I appreciate it more every time I read it.
Yeah, my first time through was definitely one of complete perplexity. Although honestly, when I read it, I saw, okay, squabbling feudal Italian kingdoms, and father gets killed and his half brother's put in place, and I was like, oh, Hamlet. But the next thoughts I really had, beyond just trying to grapple with literally any useful piece of information, was that it doesn't feel like a Shakespeare play. It feels like a parody of what, like, kind of, as he lampshades, it feels kind of like a parody of what Puritans believed Shakespeare and other similar playwrights' plays were. Where there's
and there is that
senseless violence.
There is that reference to them making fun of Puritans, I think, correct?
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
Altogether a most anti-clerical scene, perhaps intended as a sop to the Puritans of the time, a useless gesture since none of them ever went to plays regarding them for some reason as immoral.
Was there anything else? Anybody have any other things they want to bring up about the play itself?
No, I mean, I did kind of just want to point out that I think I basically already said this, but a lot of stuff that we've talked about could just be red herrings. I do think that Pynchon pretty consistently uses literary devices such as red herrings to kind of, and especially in this book, where it's so hard to figure out what's important and what's not important. And I think that that's especially comes through with the play.
Yeah. Well, I think that ties into the paranoia theme that runs through all of his books, that peppering in information and kind of forcing you to think about its importance or non-importance is a huge part of what he does. And especially in this, where there's not as much time for everything to play out, because obviously this is the shortest of his books. So there's just, it feels like there's a lot more getting thrown at you in a lot less time.
I would like to ask whether either of you believe there to be any intentional symbolism in the fact that Gennaro is the only remaining named character at the end of the play. Because I can't come up with an analog between him and the JFK assassination, really, unless you want to call LBJ Gennaro, even though LBJ never waged any sort of revolution of any kind.
Yeah,
It does seem one thing, actually, since I actually kind of vaguely meant to bring this up, but it does. The narrator of the book does mention the fact that when this play was written and performed, it would have been a little bit before the British Civil War, which at the time of when this book was published, I do think one thing I took a grad school class about the Beatles in a few years ago, and part of my research was just kind of generally about the 60s for this paper. And one thing that kind of came through a little bit stronger whenever I was doing some independent research is how close to revolution we got in the 60s. I feel like that can kind of get lost in translation sometimes. I don't it's not as emphasized as it used to be, just how unstable the country was. So it does seem to be, I mean, and the Crying of Lot 49 could almost have a similar kind of role, or like a similar type of timeline, as in, like it came out in 66, which would have been about a year or two before things got like really chaotic in America, which I think is interesting. That the play seems to kind of presage the British Civil War, while Pynchon's work seems to kind of be like a lead into how revolutionary things almost got.
Yeah, we might even be missing an entire reading of the play as a metaphor for the running up to the Civil War. Because sure, the discord's there, but maybe we just, as non-English historians, lack the context to understand that this is clearly a direct metaphor for this Earl fighting this Duke or something. And just the last thing I can think of is the recurring moment in the play is the allusion to Tristero without the name being said. Like, for example, after Duke Angelo orders people to pursue Niccolo. He says, the sentence is, Vittorio knows, every flunky in the court idling around in their swamulia livery and exchanging significant looks knows. It is all a big in-joke. The audiences of the time knew. Angelo knows, but he does not say. As close as he comes does not illuminate. And it's just it's a recurring thing for Oedipa, feeling like she's outside of the joke, but seeing all of the components of it.
You know what? I have one more thing. I just remembered I had this tab up. So the Pynchon wiki mentioned something that I've been racking my brain for the last couple of days trying to see if I could figure it out, but I can't. So in the page that they have on the Courier's tragedy itself, it says, but amidst the entire mess, there's really only one plot element not fully explained. Niccolo is sent from Angelo bearing a letter. This letter was the, quote, lying document in which Angelo sues for peace, but that letter isn't found on Niccolo's, but that isn't the letter found on Niccolo's body. The new letter, although bearing the same seal as the original, is a confession by Angelo of all his crimes, closing with the revelation of what really happened to the lost guard of Fagio. Although seemingly written by Angelo, it makes reference to Niccolo's death, which just happened. Since Angelo is presently in an orgy and in any case back in his castle, it's clear that this new letter is a forgery by who else but Trastero. So Trastero is summoned by Angelo to kill Niccolo. They betray Angelo, kill Niccolo anyway, but all to incite Gennaro to destroy Squamuglia. So that whole paragraph alone just makes my head hurt trying to wrap my brain around everything that happened earlier. But I wanted to know what y'all, if y'all picked up on that at all or noticed that, because I had never thought about it until it was there and I saw it.
I have two readings of that. Either that if the Trastero is really that same, and this is a minor spoilers for chapter 5, I think. If Trastero is what WASTE, then they are letter carriers. You know, they killed the guy, but they took a letter and they left a letter. And you know, no reason Angelo couldn't have written a new letter in time. And alternatively, that it's a comment on reading things like the Warren Report, that it can either be a whole mess of nothing, just a bunch of like weird grandstanding like Niccolo reads, or it could be like what Gennaro receives, which is a confession to all of your misdeeds. Any ideas, Luke?
Yeah, I didn't pick up on that at all whenever I was reading. It does, the Pynchon wiki does point out this does seem to speak to how Trastero can kind of seem a bit like all encompassing or so devious that there's nothing that they won't do in order to achieve their ends, which doesn't really come through in the rest of this book, I would say, necessarily. It speaks to a sinister aspect to the Trastero that doesn't seem to be present in the 1960s version, I would say.
And I just want to make it clear, my understanding of the like, oh, there's no reason that Angelo couldn't have written it is not that, like, you know, the wiki is just lying. You know, it's just that it doesn't seem obvious to me that you know, just because Angelo is currently in an orgy when Niccolo dies doesn't mean that, you know, he sent the assassins. He knew they were gonna kill him.
Yeah, I might have to go back and just reread it again with that in mind and try to parse out what I can. Well, that I think does it for our little bonus episode on the Courier's tragedy. So we'll be with our new episode. We'll be back to cover chapter 4 on our regular schedule, and I would really appreciate if, you know, people wrote in either to the email mappingthezonepod@gmail.com or drop something in on the subreddit. I'm curious to see how other people interpreted the play and what they thought of it.
Yeah, we can't have gotten everything out in the past, you know, 30 or so minutes.
No, but that'll do it for us. We will catch everyone when we come back with our chapter 4 discussion.
Bye.
All right, see y'all.